On a stormy night, a poor black young woman found a frail, memory-impaired elderly lady trembling outside her door. Without hesitation, she took the old woman in, offering her food and shelter. The next day, she had no choice but to bring her to the cafe where she worked. Though she did her best to ensure the woman's presence wouldn't interfere with her job, her cruel boss was displeased and immediately fired her. She braced herself for the worst until a stranger walked in. It was the elderly woman's son, bringing an offer that could change her life forever. Rain lashed against the window panes, the wind howling like a wounded beast outside. The small apartment trembled with each powerful gust, as if the storm itself sought to consume it. Inside, under the dim glow of a flickering light bulb, Mia sat hunched over a battered wooden table, her fingers tightening around a crumpled medical bill. The ink was slightly smudged from where her tears had fallen earlier, but she didn't have time to cry anymore. Bills piled high in front of her. Rent, electricity, water, and then, the worst of them all, the hospital fees for her mother, who lay weak and frail in the other room, her breathing shallow, her strength dwindling with each passing day. Mia had done everything she could, taken extra shifts, skipped meals, even borrowed money she wasn't sure she could ever repay. But it was never enough. A violent gust rattled the loose window latch, snapping her out of her spiraling thoughts. She sighed and stood, rubbing the exhaustion from her eyes as she walked over to fasten it properly before the cold night air crept inside. But just as she reached out, her breath hitched in her throat. Through the rain-streaked glass, barely visible in the dim glow of the streetlight, sat a lone figure, huddled on the doorstep, a frail, elderly woman, her silver hair soaked and plastered against her wrinkled skin, her thin arms wrapped around herself in a feeble attempt to ward off the cold. Her clothes, far too light for the weather, clung to her trembling body, and her expression, lost and vacant, sent a pang through Mia's chest. She didn't hesitate. Throwing open the door, she stepped into the downpour, icy rain immediately drenching her own thin sweatshirt, but she didn't care. "Ma'am," Mia called out over the storm, "are you okay?" The old woman barely reacted, only lifting her face slightly, eyes clouded with confusion. Her lips moved as if searching for the right words, but all that came out was a weak murmur. This is my home." Mia blinked. She glanced back at her apartment, then at the woman. That couldn't be right. She had lived here for years, and there was no way this woman belonged here. But she didn't have time to question it. The rain was relentless, and the old woman looked on the verge of collapse. Mia crouched down, her own fingers already numb from the cold, and gently touched the woman's shoulder. "Come inside, okay? You can't stay out here in this weather." For a moment the old woman hesitated, but as another strong gust hit, she gave a slight, uncertain nod. Mia wrapped an arm around her and helped her inside, her muscles straining under the woman's frail weight. The door shut behind them, muting the roar of the storm. A shiver ran down Mia's spine, but she quickly turned her focus back to the woman, whose frail body trembled violently. Without a second thought, Mia rushed to grab a clean towel from the tiny linen closet, returning to gently pat down the woman's drenched hair and shoulders. "Let's get you warmed up," Mia murmured, her voice softer now. "I'll find you some dry clothes, okay?" The woman only blinked at her, still lost in whatever fog filled her mind. Mia's chest tightened. She had seen people like this before, lost, confused, their memories slipping away like sand through their fingers. Her mother wasn't there yet, but she had nightmares about the day it would happen. Would someone take her in if she wandered alone in the rain, scared and disoriented? Or would she be left out in the cold, ignored by the world? Shaking the thought away, Mia moved quickly. She found an old sweater and a pair of sweatpants, probably too big, but they'd do. She helped the woman change, mindful of her fragile limbs, then guided her to sit by the small heater in the corner of the room. "You must be hungry," Mia said, more to herself than anything, as she turned toward the tiny kitchen. There wasn't much, just some rice, a couple of eggs, a few vegetables she had been saving for the week. But she couldn't let the woman go hungry, not after all she'd been through. As she started cooking, the apartment filled with the comforting scent of warm food, chasing away some of the cold that had settled in. When she placed a steaming bowl of simple rice porridge in front of the woman, the old lady's lip quivered slightly. Thank you, dear, she whispered, her voice barely audible. Mia swallowed past the lump in her throat. You don't have to thank me, she said gently, watching as the woman took slow, careful bites. As the minutes stretched on, the storm outside continued to rage, but inside the small apartment felt a little less lonely. And as Mia sat across from the woman, quietly making sure she ate enough, a single thought rooted itself deep in her mind. Tomorrow she would take the woman to the police, but no matter what happened, she would not let her be alone. The next morning, the rain had finally stopped, but the cold lingered in the air. A soft gray light filtered through the thin curtains, casting shadows across the tiny apartment. Mia sat at the small table, her fingers wrapped around a chipped mug of coffee, watching the elderly woman across from her. The woman, who had introduced herself only as Elena in a fleeting moment of clarity the night before, was staring out the window, her frail hands resting in her lap, eyes filled with a distant, vacant sadness. Mia had barely slept. Every few hours she had woken up to check on Elena, making sure she hadn't wandered off in the night. But now morning had come, and she had no choice but to do what she knew was right. Setting her mug down, she cleared her throat gently. Elena, we're going to the police station, okay? They might be able to help find your family. Elena blinked as if trying to process the words, then simply nodded. There was no recognition in her expression, no sign that she even knew she was lost. Mia's heart clenched, but she forced a small smile. Come on, she said softly, helping the woman to her feet. Let's get you home. The walk to the police station was quiet, the city still damp from the storm. When they arrived, the inside was just as Mia expected, fluorescent lights buzzing faintly, the sharp scent of stale coffee and ink filling the air. A bored-looking officer sat behind the desk, barely glancing up as Mia approached. Excuse me, she started, keeping her voice steady. I found this woman outside my apartment last night. She's lost and doesn't remember where she lives. Can you check if anyone's reported her missing? The officer finally looked up, his gaze shifting lazily to Elena. He let out a sigh, then clicked around on his computer for a few seconds before shaking his head. No reports matching her description, he said flatly, already looking like he wanted to move on. Mia frowned. That's it? That's all you're going to do? The officer gave a half-hearted shrug. We'll keep her information on file. If someone calls looking for her, we'll let you know. Mia clenched her jaw, frustration burning beneath her skin. So you're just going to let her wander the streets until then? We don't have the resources to house every lost old lady in the city, he replied, his tone dripping with indifference. If you're so concerned, you can take care of her yourself. Mia's fingers tightened into fists at her sides, but she forced herself to take a deep breath. She glanced at Elena, who stood quietly beside her, looking around the station with innocent confusion. She was so vulnerable, so unaware of how easily the world could swallow her whole. Mia turned back to the officer, her voice firm. Fine, I will. Without another word, she reached for Elena's hand, giving it a reassuring squeeze as she led her back outside. The air was crisp, the streets bustling with people rushing to work, the world moving on as if nothing had happened. As they walked, a nagging thought settled in Mia's mind. She had to work today. She couldn't afford to miss another shift. But leaving Elena alone wasn't an option. What if she wandered off again? What if she got hurt? Mia glanced down at the woman beside her, her decision solidifying. Looks like you're coming to work with me, she murmured, offering a small, reassuring smile. Elena simply nodded, as if she had no other choice, and maybe she didn't, but neither did Mia. The cafe was already bustling when Mia stepped inside, the rich scent of coffee and fresh pastries thick in the air. She held Elena's hand firmly, guiding her to a small table tucked in the corner, away from the rush of morning customers. The old woman sat down slowly, her movements careful and uncertain, her eyes scanning the unfamiliar surroundings with quiet curiosity. Mia crouched beside her, speaking gently. I'll be right over there, okay? Just sit here, relax. If you need anything, just wave at me. Elena nodded absently, her fingers tracing the rim of the water glass Mia had placed in front of her. Satisfied, Mia straightened, adjusted her apron, and rushed behind the counter, where the usual chaos of the morning shift awaited. She worked as fast as she could, stealing glances at Elena whenever she had a second to breathe. The woman sat quietly, sipping water, occasionally nibbling at the piece of bread Mia had bought for her. As the hours dragged on, Mia felt the weight of exhaustion settle on her shoulders, her mind constantly flickering between work and the elderly woman in the corner. Then, suddenly, her phone vibrated in the pocket of her apron. Pulling it out with slightly trembling fingers, she glanced at the unknown number before answering. "Hello?" The voice on the other end was urgent, breathless. "Is this Mia? My name is Ethan. My mother has been missing since yesterday. The police gave me your number." Mia's heart leapt in her chest. "She's here. She's safe. You can come right now." There was a pause, a sharp inhale of relief. "I'll be there immediately." As soon as the call ended, Mia exhaled, tension easing from her body. Finally, Elena would be reunited with her family. She glanced over at the old woman, who was now stirring her water with a spoon, unaware of the relief washing over Mia. But before she could even process her emotions, a sharp voice cut through the air. "Mia." She stiffened instantly. "Amy." She turned just as the cafe manager approached, her arms crossed tightly over her chest, lips pressed into a thin, disapproving line. "Mia," Amy repeated, voice clipped. "That old woman has been sitting here all day, and what has she ordered? A single glass of water and a piece of bread?" Her eyes narrowed, dripping with condescension. "You think this place is some kind of charity?" Mia's stomach twisted, but she kept her expression neutral. She had known this confrontation was inevitable the moment she walked through the doors with Elena, but that didn't make it any easier. She took a steady breath, keeping her voice calm. "I paid for her food, Amy. She's not bothering anyone." Amy let out a short, humorless laugh, tilting her head as if she couldn't believe what she was hearing. "Oh, please, don't act like this is about money. It's about appearances, Mia. Customers don't want to see some sad old woman loitering in the corner, taking up space, making the place look like a damn shelter." Her voice dripped with disgust, her carefully curated professionalism cracking just enough to reveal what lay beneath. Mia's hands clenched into fists at her sides, but she forced herself to remain composed. "She has nowhere else to go," she said evenly, refusing to give Amy the reaction she was looking for. "That's not my problem," Amy shot back, stepping closer, lowering her voice to a sharp whisper. "But let me tell you what is my problem. You bringing this charity case into my cafe, making it everyone else's problem." Her eyes flicked toward Elena, filled with thinly veiled contempt. "And if she's that helpless, maybe she should have thought ahead instead of waiting around for people like you to feel sorry for." Mia's breath hitched, her body tensed so suddenly it almost hurt. She had spent her entire life swallowing her anger, learning to pick her battles, knowing there were things she couldn't change, people she couldn't fight, but this was different. She lifted her chin, her voice quiet but firm. "Don't talk about her like that." Amy blinked, caught off guard by the steel in Mia's tone, but the shock quickly melted into something colder. "Excuse me?" "I said," Mia repeated, louder this time, her hands shaking with barely contained fury. "Don't talk about her like that. She's done nothing wrong, and if this is the kind of place that looks down on people just because they need help, then maybe I don't belong here either." For a brief second, something flickered across Amy's face, surprise perhaps, or maybe even the realization that she had pushed too far, but then, just as quickly, she straightened, her lips curling into a smirk. "Well, then I guess that makes things easier." Her voice was light, almost amused. "You're fired." The words landed like a slap, sharp and humiliating, but Mia barely registered them. She wasn't afraid of losing this job, not anymore. What scared her was the way Elena flinched at Amy's words, the way she curled in on herself, small and fragile, as if she had been scolded for simply existing. Mia's chest ached. She opened her mouth to say something, anything, but before she could, the cafe doors swung open with force. The sudden gust of cold air sent a ripple through the room, and every head turned toward the entrance. And there he was, tall, broad-shouldered, dressed in an expensive suit that screamed authority. He scanned the cafe with sharp, restless eyes. And then they landed on Elena. His entire body tensed, his breath caught. "Mom?" Eleanor's head lifted at the sound of his voice, her cloudy eyes flickering with something almost like recognition. For a moment she just stared, as if trying to grasp onto a memory just out of reach. Then her lips parted, her voice barely a whisper. "Ethan?" The man crossed the cafe in an instant, kneeling beside her chair, his hands hovering, as if afraid she might disappear if he touched her too suddenly. His sharp, composed exterior cracked, and the raw emotion beneath it spilled through. Relief, fear, guilt, everything he had been holding back since she vanished. "Mom." His voice wavered, thick with something unspoken. "I've been looking for you everywhere." Alina blinked slowly, her fingers reaching out hesitantly. When he caught them in his own, warm and steady, something in her expression softened. She exhaled shakily, as if the weight of the world had finally lifted from her fragile shoulders. I got lost," she murmured, her brows knitting together. "I was trying to go home." Ethan swallowed hard, nodding as he squeezed her hands. "I know. It's okay now. You're safe." Mia stood frozen, watching the scene unfold, an unexpected lump forming in her throat. She had never seen him before, but now, looking at him, at the way his usually composed demeanor had crumbled in the presence of his mother, she understood. He wasn't just some wealthy businessman, he was a son who had nearly lost the most important person in his life. Then, as if suddenly remembering where they were, Ethan turned, his eyes locking onto Mia, and for the first time she saw it. Recognition, gratitude, something deeper than words could capture. "You're the one who took care of her," he said, his voice quieter now, steadier. It wasn't a question. It was a realization. Mia shifted on her feet, suddenly self-conscious. I couldn't leave her alone." Ethan studied her for a long moment, as if trying to understand her completely in just that brief exchange. Then his gaze flickered toward Amy, who had been standing off to the side, silent ever since he walked in. Amy, who now looked painfully small under the weight of his attention. She was just about to leave, Mia said before she could stop herself, and Amy stiffened. Ethan's expression didn't change. "Is that so?" His voice was polite, unreadable, but there was an unmistakable edge beneath it, one that made Amy pale slightly. Amy started, but he had already looked away, dismissing her entirely. Instead he turned back to Mia. "Come with me." Mia blinked, startled. "What?" Ethan stood, his hands still wrapped protectively around Elena's. "I want to talk," he said simply. "Somewhere else." Mia hesitated, glancing between them, unsure of what was happening, but then she looked at Elena, at the way she clung to her son like an anchor, and she knew there was only one answer. Okay. The cafe, the job, the confrontation with Amy, none of it mattered anymore. She had done what she needed to do, and as she followed Ethan and Elena out into the crisp afternoon air, she had the strangest feeling that, for the first time in a long while, she wasn't walking toward another dead end. She was walking towards something new. A moment later, Mia sat across from Ethan in a quiet, upscale restaurant, far from the noisy cafe, far from everything she had known. The contrast was almost overwhelming. The sleek modern decor, the hushed voices of well-dressed patrons, the way the servers moved with effortless precision. It was a world she had never belonged to, and yet here she was, sitting across from a man who owned more wealth than she could fathom. She had learned who he was after they left the cafe. Ethan Sinclair, self-made millionaire, founder and CEO of Sinclair Coffee, one of the fastest-growing coffeehouse chains in the country. His name carried weight, power, influence, yet despite all that, he had looked at his mother with nothing but raw relief, and at Mia with genuine gratitude. He had wanted to hear her story, and when she hesitated, he had simply said, "Please." So she told him. About her mother, about the bills, about the constant struggle of trying to keep her head above water in a world that never seemed to let her breathe. Ethan listened, not with the detached politeness of someone who felt obligated, but with the quiet intensity of someone who genuinely cared. And when she finished, when the silence stretched between them, he finally spoke. "I want to help you." Mia blinked, caught off guard. "What?" He leaned forward, his expression serious. "You saved my mother. You cared for her when no one else would. That means something to me. And I don't believe in repaying kindness with just words." She opened her mouth to protest, but he was already pulling out a checkbook. "This is for your mother's medical bills," he said, scribbling down a number and sliding the check across the table. Mia's breath caught in her throat. The amount, more than she had ever seen in her life, was enough to wipe out her mother's hospital debt completely. Her hands trembled as she picked it up, unable to comprehend what was happening. "Ethan, this is too much. I can't." "You can." His voice was firm, but not unkind. "And that's not all." Mia looked up, still dazed. "I own Sinclair Coffee," he continued, his gaze unwavering. "I built it from the ground up. And I see something in you, Mia. You have passion, resilience, and you clearly care about people. That's the kind of person I want in my company." She stared at him, completely stunned. "I'm offering you a full barista training course, everything from sourcing beans to mastering the craft. And beyond that, I want you to take a business management course, fully paid for, so that when the time is right, you can step into a leadership role." His lips quirked slightly. "You stood up for what was right, even when it cost you your job. That's the kind of strength I want in my team." Mia's head spun. She had spent so long just trying to survive that she had never dared to think beyond the next paycheck, the next overdue bill, and now, sitting across from her, a millionaire was not just offering her financial relief, but a future, a real chance to grow, to thrive. She swallowed hard, emotion threatening to choke her. "I don't know what to say." Ethan's expression softened. "Say yes." Mia exhaled shakily, her fingers tightening around the check, around the possibility of something more. For the first time in her life, she wasn't just being offered help. She was being offered a future. And this time, she wasn't going to let it slip away. Join us to share meaningful stories by hitting the like and subscribe buttons. Don't forget to turn on the notification bell to start your day with profound lessons and heartfelt empathy.